Welcome to the Bob Woodruff Foundation's Got Your Six Good Intel webinar series. This is our second of 3 sessions in the series. Our goal for this series is to help elevate the functional expertise of the Got Your Six network and to give you those tools in your toolbox to best serve your communities. I'm Deirdre Armstrong, the Director of Local Partnerships at the Bob Woodruff Foundation. I'm thrilled to see so many familiar faces and names on the call today. Lots of folks who tuned into the session last week are back for session 2, and that's so great to see, because I think you'll see several references to that session as we go along here today. Most of you are already part of the Got Your Six network, made up of our local partners and grantees. Thank you for your tireless work to support veterans, service members, and their families nationwide. We appreciate you taking the time out of your incredibly busy schedules to join us today. I know many of you wear multiple hats in your communities, and carving out time for an hour here or there is difficult. For those on the call less familiar with the Got Your Six network, I encourage you to take a look at our website, where you'll find a directory of our local partners, as well as a submission form to learn more about joining the network. And you'll see that link in our chat. But before we go further, I'd like to pause for a few remarks from our CEO, who is so excited about our series and appreciative of all that you do. She sent this message.
Hey there, I'm Anne-Marie Doherty, CEO of the Bob Woodruff Foundation. First, I want to say thank you to all the partners in BWF's Got Your Six network. Collectively, the amazing grantees and local partners who make up BWF's Got Your Six network reach millions of veterans, service members, and their families in more than 100 communities across the country. You have a vital, boots-on-the-ground perspective about the needs of veterans in your community and what you need in order to serve them better. We've got your back with free programming inspired by your insights and designed to maximize your impact. That includes learning opportunities like expert panels, webinars, and original research. It can include exclusive funding opportunities, and it includes connecting you with like-minded organizations to network, foster collaboration, and amplify your work. We know we're stronger together. With our network's national reach and your local impact, there's nothing we can't do. So let's show veterans everywhere we've got their six.
Today's session will highlight the importance of financial transparency. We'll make a case for why transparency can help your organization and give you that detailed look at some of the items Bob Woodruff Foundation grant officers look at in each organization's finances when they are reviewing grant applications. Before we dive in here, I'd like to bring your attention to a poll to get a sense of our audience's familiarity with financial transparency. Can folks see the poll? Feel free to mention in chat there. I think, Hunter, it might just be visible to our team, perhaps. We can always return to the poll at the end of the session. It's a way of us taking the pulse of folks to understand your familiarity with the issue. But perhaps we can just return to it at the conclusion of the session. While there are so many ways that the Bob Woodruff Foundation is able to invest in organizations, this session is specifically reflective of the Foundation's grant-making program's evaluation process. Our grants team reviews applications for funding from a wide range of organizations each grant cycle. The most common reasons of why an organization falls out of our application process are generally related to a concern about their financial sustainability, responsibility, or transparency. This was really the motivation for us to host today's session. Today, two of my colleagues on our grants team will share what funders and supporters review in your filings and how decisions about staffing, fundraising, and programming impact not just your bottom line, but that story that your financials tell. In today's session, part three, the final of our series, I apologize, part three, the final session of our series will be led by our communications department, focusing on the power of narrative. We learned late last year in the Andy Robinson series that importance of storytelling when speaking to funders is crucial. And if you haven't signed up for session 3, please do. You'll find the link in our chat. Next, I'd like to hand it over to the experts. First, my colleague, Komal Kamdar. Komal is a program officer on our grants team. And next, my colleague, Emily Bader, BWF's Director of Grants. I'll let Komal take it from here.
Thank you so much, Dee. As my colleague Deirdre mentioned, BWF partners with organizations in lots of ways. My team is specifically responsible for reviewing grant applications and determining which programs to fund. Unfortunately, we do not always have the resources to fund everyone who we want to fund. And financial due diligence is just one way that we narrow this pool of grant applicants each cycle. Every organization we decline to fund has the opportunity to talk to someone on my team about why their application was declined. These calls made us realize that a lot of organizations just don't realize the importance of some of the financial and management practices that funders consider when making these decisions. This was really the impetus for us to host today's session, to be fully transparent about our own review process. Keep in mind that the Bob Woodruff Foundation is just one funder, and different funders have different priorities and ways that they evaluate an organization's financial stability and management practices. We're going to have this conversation today through the lens of a 990, since that's often the document that the public and potential funders commonly use as their primary or their sole source of information about a particular organization. We are by no means accountants or experts on tax forms, but the Bob Woodruff Foundation and other prospective funders use these forms to better understand the inner workings of organizations who apply for funding, and we're eager to share some of this insight with you all today. Our goal for this session is not to be prescriptive about which practices are right or wrong, since that's largely subjective, but rather to encourage conversations across your organization about the external message that your public filings demonstrate to the public, prospective funders, and any other stakeholders. I will be going through some of the more narrative components of a 990 first, and then my colleague Emily Bader will go through some fiscal components. Before we jump into walking through a 990, I'm going to touch on why discussing this topic is just so important. Most members of the public rely on a public filing like a Form 990 as their primary or sole source of information about a particular organization. Beyond legal compliance and ethical standards, the disclosures necessary for financial transparency can actually offer profound benefits to nonprofits. After all, disclosures offer an opportunity to tell a story about your organization. You can highlight that the impact that donations make, the expertise of your staff, and your history of service. Financial transparency is crucial to your organization's public image, mission, and goals. It helps facilitate open conversation with prospective donors and other stakeholders. It inspires people's confidence, trust, and willingness to cooperate. The importance of transparent practices and procedures applies to both legal and ethical aspects. The story you tell through your financials is an opportunity to boast about how well you do what you do and how impactful the donor's dollar really is. There are many benefits to financial transparency, as conduct that is accountable and transparent earns stakeholders' trust and can reinforce a positive workplace culture for your employees. 3 specific potential benefits are increased engagement, increased contributions, and improved donor relationships. Digging into each of these topics. First, increased engagement. Organizations must be transparent about their financials to ensure all stakeholders, including donors, board, staff, and volunteers, really understand the numbers. Transparency breeds ownership. When the people who care about your organization understand more about the financial foundation of the group, they feel a bit more responsible for their small piece of the pie than before. When they feel that greater sense of ownership and responsibility, they'll ultimately become more engaged. They'll stay involved longer and make a deeper commitment when they understand how their work impacts that bigger picture. Next, it can increase contributions. GuideStar published a study that showed that transparent nonprofits received 53% more in contributions than less transparent organizations. This study of 6,300 organizations showed that those who shared more than just their basic 990 on GuideStar and earned their GuideStar seal of transparency earned more the following year. Lastly, it can improve your relationships with donors. Going above and beyond that basic 990 and audited financials and sharing more intimate details about your organization's financial health will help to improve donor stewardship and relationships. Building that trust and those open relationships with donors can help retain ongoing support. Now that we've looked at some of the potential benefits of financial transparency, let's take a look at different filing options for nonprofits. For those of you who are less familiar with 990s, the 4 most common 990 forms include 990s, 990EZs, 990Ns, also known as e-postcards, and 990 PFs. The full-length 990 form is required for nonprofits who gross $200,000 or more in total receipts or have a total assets of $500,000 or more. The 990EZ as well as the 990N are for nonprofits who grossed less during the year. So over $50,000 in total gross receipts for the 990EZ and under $50,000 for the 990N. And the 990 PF lastly is for private foundations. The amount of information that's required for each of these forms varies. If your organization only has to complete the 990EZ, consider that you're making less information publicly available. There are groups that are exempt from these requirements, to include churches, for example, but they're still able to file if they choose to do so. At BWF, we occasionally receive applications from organizations that say that they're not required to file. However, since we use the information found in a 990 to inform our funding decisions, we cannot move forward with considering such organizations in our grant process unless they voluntarily file a 990. For those of you who use a fiscal sponsor, it's important to know what financial forms they publicly file and the contents of those filings. Now that you have this background, let's roll into some of the more specific components we look at in a filing. The first thing that really pops out to us as an organization is your mission and your vision statement. Just like people, organizations need not only a direction, but a clear idea of what your goals are and how to go about achieving them. An organization's employees need a sense of cohesiveness in order to collaborate in harmony and work towards that shared goal. A mission statement is a short summary of an organization's core purpose, its focus, and its aims. This usually is comprised of a brief description of what the organization does and its key objectives. It often defines the day-to-day activities of work and explains how each person who works for the organization contributes to that overall mission. The mission statement should really drive the organization. Moreover, the vision statement is a supplement to the mission statement. A vision statement is a short description of an organization's aspirations and the wider impact it aims to create. It acts as a guiding beacon to those within the organization, as well as something that sets the ground for internal decision-making and determines the intended direction of the organization. A vision statement is meant to be a clear, definitive statement of what an organization wants to accomplish and what the world will look like once they've accomplished that mission. The vision statement gives the organization direction and can inspire and motivate employees and other stakeholders to engage fully in your organization's work. While your organization's mission answers how you want to accomplish your organization's goals, the vision answers what your organization wants to ultimately accomplish. Your organization's mission is one of the first things a reviewer sees on your public filings, so consider how clear it is to an external viewer. At BWF, we want to understand an organization's focus or expertise working with the military and veteran population. Take a second and think about your own organization's mission statement. Does it mention veterans? Does it mention the military? Let's dive into the next section of the filing, which discusses your organization's program service accomplishments. Think of this section as where you talk through your organization's outputs and outcomes. This section of your filing can help people understand what you're doing and why. It's really your opportunity to boast about your organization's main programs. A useful description of your program service accomplishments will, first, be clear and concise. It'll use specific measurements, for example, clients served, days of care provided, number of sessions or events held, or publications issued. It will describe the activity's objective for both this time period and the longer-term goal. If the output is intangible, for example, research activities. It will also give reasonable estimates for any statistical information if exact figures aren't readily available. The Schedule O in your 990 gives you the opportunity to elaborate on the section as needed. It can help you tell the story of who your organization is and how much has been accomplished. There are various sections of a 990 that provide details about an organization's leadership, staff, volunteers, and board members. When the Bob Woodruff Foundation is reviewing the internal structure of an organization, one of the things that we look at is the expertise of an organization's leadership team and staff. We really just want to understand the extent of your team's connection to the issues your organization is addressing. In other words, if your organization is dedicating to improving veterans' mental health, are there any clinicians currently on staff? We also take a look at the extent of diversity and lived experience across an organization's board and staff. Think about your own board for a second. Is your board diverse in background and specialties? And does it include members with lived experience? For example, if your organization is dedicated to serving caregivers, are there any caregivers on your board or staff? Do your current board members represent a mix of industries and career levels, such as financial services, communications, the military? Are they a fair mix of mid-level in their career, or are they all senior executives? Or on the other hand, is your board primarily composed of family members? We're looking here at the extent of family relationships throughout the organization. For instance, are all of the board members and key employees from the organization all related? Different funders prefer different structures. Some funders may want a more family effort, and other funders may prefer a more formal professional board. Additionally, the extent to which volunteers are conducting the organization's operations is important to us. We want to know who exactly is providing the programming to the populations you serve. Is it primarily paid staff or volunteers? The third thing we consider in internal structure is what kind of policies are in place to protect both your organization and its employees. Organizations should take a look and consider the internal policies to address things like conflicts of interest and whistleblowers. When we're looking for potential conflicts of interest between a board member and paid staff, one thing we check is if the organization is providing or receiving discounted services from a board member's business. The last thing we consider here is the extent to which an organization has local chapters, local branches, or other similar local units or affiliates. In other words, are there any other entities over which the organization has legal authority to exercise direct or indirect supervision and control? Think about your own organization for a moment. Are you receiving funding from a national organization that you're a local chapter of? Or on the other hand, are you a national organization providing funding or supervision to a chapter network? We want to understand the extent and purpose of these relationships. Diving into external relationships now, external relationships are another indicator of how an organization manages its operations. These fall into three categories: independent contractors, professional fundraising services, and external related organizations. Independent contractors first can include law and accounting firms, as well as publishing, management, and investment management companies. Professional fundraising services include the planning, management, preparation of materials, the advice or consultation about fundraising, and any direct fundraising efforts. When looking at this section, stakeholders may consider the amount of effort that is being conducted by external parties and the amount of money that goes towards these efforts. We also look at what services are being contracted out. For instance, is the organization contracting a third party to handle activities directly related to their mission? Keep in mind that risk tolerance for investing in professional fundraising is also quite subjective. One organization might choose to spend a significant amount of funding towards, let's say, a direct mail campaign, while others might consider the effort wasteful. BWF also considers if an organization is legally connected to another nonprofit or for-profit and be interested in how funding flows between them. For example, we've received applications in the past from nonprofits whose financials clearly show that they're funneling funding to support a connected for-profit. We've also seen applications from organizations that use a variety of nonprofits with different EINs to obscure their overall financial position. If your organization does have a lot of connections to other organizations, consider how to share the nature of those relationships with potential stakeholders. This includes organizations using a fiscal sponsor. When your organization is deciding on a fiscal sponsor, consider how much of your organization's budget they will retain and how their financials look. Now that we've examined some of the more narrative components of an I-90, I'm going to hand it off to my colleague, Emily, who's going to expand on some of the fiscal sections.
All right, thank you, Komal. So the first thing I'll go through is revenue. So your program's overall service revenue page on your 990 is going to talk to people about the flow of money into your organization. So this is one of the most kind of important sections that my team reviews because it's speaking to the overall stability and sustainability of your organization. Here we're really looking at kind of how diverse and how consistent an organization's revenue stream is. So we're specifically looking at how this revenue breaks out across categories like cash and non-cash, government or non-government funding, some related revenue streams from other organizations, and kind of dues or investments. So within this category, we're also looking at how these topics break out across in-kind and cash. So if we kind of look at one place that this pops up in your 990, just to give you a concrete example, you can see here that this section is showing that this organization is receiving, just over $1.2 million in fundraising event revenue. They've got about 2.5 in government grants and 5.6 in other contributions. And you can see just under $1 million in non-cash. So this is kind of one place that you can see that information, and we'll go over this kind of later in the presentation, but there's some differences in how much information is disclosed on this section in a regular full form 990 versus in a 990 easy. BWF's also looking at how an organization manages large single-year contributions or multi-year awards. So we know that if you're getting a multi-year award or a large gift, you have to kind of report that revenue all at once, even if you plan to spend it over the next few years. The donor is expecting you to spend it over the next few years. So what we're really curious about here is how the organization appropriately adjusts their program offerings and overall expenditures, and kind of if you are continuing to spend at the same rate, regardless of how that funding ebbs and flows, or if you're appropriately adjusting your expenditures over time. So for example, this organization here got 2.5 million in government grants. If they didn't receive that the following year, we'd really expect to see some change in overall expenditures unless they've received that revenue elsewhere. Diversity in an organization's main contributors is also something we take a look at. So there's one place that we see this in a 990 pretty explicitly, but we also see this in the section that Hunter just had up on the screen. So for the contributor section that's up here now, you get a little bit of information about who the donors are, their total contribution amount, and if that's, you know, from a person, if it's non-cash, a few more details about those main contributors. Here, we're really looking for, you know, is all of the organization's money coming from the same handful of people? And are those people really connected to the organization? So in other words, is it all coming from board members or leadership members or family members of board and leadership members? We really want to see that the organization is attracting a wide donor base and not just kind of funding their own effort. One other thing to keep in mind when you're considering your organization's kind of revenue stream, think about how much money you're asking from prospective donors. So if you typically have around, you know, maybe a $500,000 revenue stream, funders may have questions about why you're requesting $2 million, for example. So just think about how significant your requests are, given the relative size of your organization's annual budget and your proven ability to administer that level of funding. So on the flip side of this, we're also really looking at organizations' expenses. So this is where an organization's outbound funds are located. We'll go through where this is on the 990 in a moment, but here there's really kind of three categories to keep an eye on, and that is your program spend, your fundraising spend, and management in general. So what we are looking at here is how those three categories kind of relate to one another, specifically regarding compensation, maybe grant making to other organizations, kind of conferences or fees for services. And if we kind of look at these things, what we're really trying to understand is what the organization is spending on kind of third parties, like Komal mentioned, kind of what these third parties are being paid to do and why, and the proportion of those to the overall budget. So for example, if contractors are being brought in, are they being paid for direct programmatic activities or kind of third part, like tertiary activities like legal services or accounting? On the grant making front, we're looking at kind of like the purpose of those grants. If it's being funneled to another related organization, we want to understand why. Same thing for a related for-profit organization. So we also are taking a look at whether compensation is reasonable and appropriate. And this is kind of across directors, officers, and key employees. So here, think about kind of the overall percentage of executive salaries that's related to your organization's budget. Are you paying people enough to retain them? How does payment break out between the executive kind of C-suite versus your staff? And also volunteers, how are you compensating them, if at all. Another component we can see related to compensation is severance payments. So here we're considering both severance payments and overall compensation for individuals that may be moving back and forth between your organization and a prior employer, or maybe a for-profit arm that's connected to a nonprofit. So there may be some questions there. And we also look at kind of the other section of your 990. So here we're looking at how big of a proportion other expenses are, kind of what those expenses look like in relation to your organization's overall activities. So if we move forward to the next slide and look at that overall statement of functional expenses, I know this is really small, so I'll talk you through it. Just wanted to make sure everyone could see what this ultimately looks like on your 990. So here you can see that big box at the top is showing you those 3 categories I mentioned. So the first column is total, and then it breaks out across program, management, general, and fundraising expenses. So as I mentioned, these categories are really important because this is how we calculate the program spend. So if you see those 2 circles down at the bottom, this is kind of giving you a visual of how to calculate your program spend, which is by dividing your organization's total program expenses, or excuse me, your total program expenses by your organization's total expenses. So if you see here, the organization is spending about 7.5 million in programmatic activities, and they're dividing it by their total expenses, which is 8.7. Couple of notes on program spend. I thought it was interesting to point out kind of this section on the slide here from Charity Navigator. So they've reported that 7 out of 10 of the organizations that they look at reported a program spend of at least 75%. And then 9 out of 10 have at least 65% program spend. And then just to be really clear on what that means out of every dollar, the organization's putting 75 cents toward programmatic activities. When we're talking about program spend, it's really easy to assume that the higher the program spend, the better. And while it's true that you definitely want to be putting most of your efforts toward programmatic spend, sometimes for younger organizations, in order to kind of support, grow, and maintain sustainable programming over the long term, they really need to dedicate some other expenses toward those efforts. So we may see that kind of younger organizations might need to put a little bit more money behind retaining strong leadership to help guide the organization as it grows and develops. What you really want to do is kind of look at program spend in context of the size and maturity of the organization. Again, younger organizations might need to invest more in managerial and fundraising efforts more than kind of larger, more established organizations. Just be really clear on kind of what stage your organization is at and what funder is appropriate for you based on that. Really be prepared to tell that story to potential donors. The transparency about your expenses is really going to help you demonstrate to those prospective donors kind of that you're using their dollars effectively, and where that funding is going, even if it does include kind of a short-term emphasis on non-programmatic areas. So we went through what that program spend calculation, where that comes from on the full form 990. Here is an example where it looks, where you can look for it on a 990 EZ. So here it's kind of broken out across the first 2 pages. You can see the total expenses are 100,000, and then the programmatic service expenses are 80,000 in this example. I wanted to specifically highlight this because a really common error that we get from organizations who submit a 990 EZ is that they're not properly filling out the statement of program service accomplishments. As Komal mentioned, we take calls with all of the organizations that we decline for funding, and more often than not, for organizations that were declined in part because of program spend, they're not really paying attention as much to this section and how important that might be to prospective funders. So if you do file an easy or the full Form 990, just remember that there are some funders who are looking at this, and they will be looking at this in different ways, but just be aware of what your organization's program spend is and why. Moving into your balance sheet. So your balance sheet is reporting on your organization's assets, or what is owned, and your liabilities, or what is owed. So this is giving information about your organization's overall liquidity by communicating how much cash you have on hand, or what might soon be available in the form of cash. This is really important to help you get a sense, and prospective funders get a sense of how flexible and responsive your organization can be to different financial demands. So here we're specifically looking at the type of assets an organization has. So whether that's cash, buildings, investment, and the proportion of those assets that are donor restricted. So I'm sure if you all think about your own budgets, most of you, if not all of you, have probably received restricted funding. So whether that's by location, topic, type of clients. As a refresher, those donor restrictions, that may require you to spend the funding within a certain time frame or for a certain purpose. Recognizing that net assets with donor restrictions, that's really crucial, again, to understanding how liquid your organization is and how free you are to spend the funding that you have toward whatever your organization needs to in the moment. So it's going to just weigh how secure your financial position is. So if we kind of put this more simply and give you a visual example, assets minus liabilities equals net assets. So here you can see in this example, we have an organization that has $500,000 in assets, 300,000 of that is unrestricted, and then they have 250,000 in liabilities. So again, if you're taking what is owned, that 500,000, you're taking away what is owed, you end up with 250,000 in net assets. But then if you go that step further and look at donor restrictions, so you can really get a sense of what you actually have to spend, you can see that in this example, the organization that had 250 in net assets actually only has $50,000 to spend freely, since that's the only amount that isn't donor restricted. So again, this ratio of net assets compared to operating expenses and the percentage that is free of donor restriction is really going to kind of demonstrate stability to your funders and indicate how long your organization can keep its door open and keep functioning as normal if you weren't to receive more funding. So I'm sure you're all wondering what we're looking for. At BWF, we are really looking for organizations to have enough cash on hand to cover their operating expenses for a reasonable amount of time. But we're also looking for, to see if an organization has net assets that are so high that we would question the impact of any additional investment from BWF. So in other words, we'd be a little bit less interested in providing additional funding to an organization with really sizable net assets sitting as just cash in hand in the bank. One caveat to this whole conversation is that there are a lot of organizations, especially in this space, that are really reliant on either almost exclusively government grants or kind of a fee-for-service model. So in those cases, we understand an organization may be less able to build up their net assets. So again, just consider why your position is what it is and be able to articulate that to prospective funders. So we look at overall takeaways. Again, we always preface our presentations with, this is just what one funder is looking at. We get a lot of questions from organizations about what kind of financial stability and sustainability looks like for us. So we wanted to be really transparent in return and have this conversation with everyone today. Nonprofits vary in size, structure, and kind of other financial aspects. So it's really important that your organization leadership, that your board all is able to understand and articulate the details of your financial position, both where you are now and where you want to be. So in summary, consider going beyond the legal requirements. So not just filing the 990, but using transparency to work for your organization. The National Council on Nonprofits had some really good recommendations on here. The first really being tell your story to donors. Be honest in the information that you are using to solicit materials, to solicit donations from donors, kind of both how you've used donations in the past and how you may use their funding should they donate to you in the future. Involve your board. So as Komal mentioned, curate an impressive expert board. Make sure that they understand your organization's financials and that they are reviewing these and not just having one person filing them in isolation. Adopt and regularly review different policies and procedures. So whether that's having a clear conflict of interest policy, expense and reimbursement policies, compensation policies, be really clear about who is accountable for the organization's expenditures, and make sure that all of that is publicly available to the people, or that is openly available to the people within your organization, so everyone is on the same page about those policies and procedures. Also, make sure that you're implementing internal controls. It's going to ensure staff accountability. You really want to make sure who is responsible for approving what and at what point in time. And finally, use your website as a transparency tool. Kind of keep that information about your program and your organization's leadership readily available. Whether that's including names, titles, and bios for staff and board members, kind of publishing your annual reports, or like we've talked about thoroughly today, your organization's 990. Make sure that that information is kind of easy for people to find. Another thing that's a really simple addition is making sure that your organization's EIN is readily available. People use that a lot of times to kind of check what you're publishing about your organization on your own site with a third-party site. And then kind of speaking on third-party sites, consider updating your organization's information on those common third-party evaluators. So that's Charity Navigator, GuideStar, and there are others. These sites are really providing an external rating on how transparent you are about your finances. So while Charity Navigator is really explicitly scoring organizations based on their overall financial management, and it's a really great compliment to score high here, GuideStar explicitly rewards organizations for completing sections on their site about your organization. So it's absolutely worth your time to have someone from your team go on to GuideStar and fill out those sections about your organization. As Deirdre said at the top, our goal for this session was to really help kind of elevate the functional expertise of our Got Your Six network, to kind of give you some more tools. As a disclaimer, again, we are by no means experts on tax forms. We're not accountants, so we can't answer specific questions about what your organization should or shouldn't report or how. But what we do, and a lot of other funders do, is use those financial forms to get a better sense of the inner workings of the organizations who are applying for funding. So we hope that this was really useful for you all to get a sense of that today. And if you're interested in joining us for our third session, that's going to be on March 2nd. There's more information on this screen here, and Hunter already posted the link in the chat. That will be hosted by our communications team. So with that, I will pass it off to Deirdre to lead the Q&A. I know I've seen some questions coming through already. So thank you everyone for being engaged.
Thank you, Emily and Komal, for giving us that insight into your review process and sharing your expertise about this work. I know this is an extremely complex topic. It was great to see so many of you engage throughout the call during the presentation. And we'd like to return to that poll launched at the beginning of the session. And for those on the call last week, this is our simple pre-post question to gauge the value of these sessions and help us refine our efforts to give these presentations in the future. You'll see the question pop up there. How well do you understand what information potential funders might look at to evaluate your organization's financial position and overall transparency? And then, would you like more information about the topics we covered today? Great. Thank you so much for participating in that poll. Hunter's going to stop our recording. We're going to dive into some questions, and in the limited time we have left, I want to get to the most questions we have possible, and we'll prioritize those questions that benefit the broader audience. We had many questions come through direct chat through me, as well as in the general chat.